Hello everybody, my name is Lisimole and I'm a occupational therapist. So today I will briefly like to speak about a condition called autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder that impairs or affects ability to communicate, to socialize or interact. People might often also present with obsessive interest and also repetitive behavior. We call it a spectrum disorder because there's variation in the type and in the severity of the symptoms that people with autism might present with or experience. We say it's a spectrum disorder because it comprises of other conditions such as ADHD, which is attention deficit disorder, your ODD or positional defiant disorder, specific learning disorders, ADHD, which is attention deficit disorder, anxiety disorders, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, developmental delays, auditory processing is one of them. Depression is also one of condition that we tend to find amongst people living with autism. And the most common one, which we call sensory integration disorder. So today I would like to briefly explain what is sensory integration, because these sensory integration disorders are mostly common amongst people living with autism. Hence, we find that sensory integration forms part of diagnostic criteria for people with autism spectrum disorder. So each autistic person is unique. That's one thing. It's not the kind of condition that is one size fits all symptom. But you would find that every person present uniquely, differently, and they have sort of what we call their personal sensory sensitivity. The other person might be sensitive to certain things, whereas the other might not. So people with autism spectrum disorder might have sensitivity to the following: your sight. Others, they won't be able to withstand the lights, the flashing visuals that you might see on TV. People with autistic disorder might not be able to tolerate that. Others, there are things like sounds. You might find them when there's a lot of noise trying to curb their ears. Others, things like smell and the taste. You find that children with autistic disorder tend to be more choosy, picky. There are food that they would prefer a certain taste, they would not want to eat everything like other kids would. And other kids with people with autism, you might find there are people that are very sensitive to touch. Others, they love to be touched and to be hugged. And the balance is another problem that we tend to find amongst people living with autism spectrum disorder. And the proprioceptive, that is what we call the awareness of body position and movement. So sort of things like, it sounds normal to, it will look normal to people without autism to be able to be walking while answering the phone, climbing the stairs. But with autism disorder, it might be quite a challenge. Hence, we are saying they have what we call a proprioceptive disorder. So today I want to, as I said, as I mentioned before, I would like to briefly, talk more about sensory processing. As I said, sensory processing disorder is one common aspect or one common condition that we find among people with autistic spectrum disorder. So now, what is sensory processing disorder? That's what we should actually look at. So this is one condition that affects how our brain processes information. Here we're talking about sensory information. So when we talk about sensory information, we talk about things we see, things we hear, things we smell, and things we touch. So our brain needs to know that when I'm seeing something It's just a site. It will go to the brain to be processed. So we are being told that people with autism spectrum disorder, most of them have problem with those. So now we will let's try to understand this sensory processing disorder, because if this is one major problem that they struggle with, we need to be able to understand it so that we can be able to assist or help them quite effectively. So Dr. Lucy Jane Miller has actually described sensory processing disorder, and as we've mentioned, it is how the brain would actually process the sensory information. So she further went on to divide it into 3 categories, or what we call 3 patterns. The first pattern is what we call sensory modulation, and I will come back to that one because it is the one that I really want to focus on today. And the second one we call sensory-based motor disorder, and the third one is sensory discrimination disorder. So as I said, I would like to dwell much on sensory modulation disorder. So what is sensory modulation disorder? We said sensory processing disorder, processing happens when the brain processes sensory information. So sensory modulation would happen when now we give respond, we react. So would say sensory modulation is actually an ability to respond appropriately to sensory information. So now my brain has processed because I've seen this. Then for instance, let's say somebody has called me, has said Lisimule, the brain would process it. And then when I respond, because you called my name, I need to react. That we called sensory modulation. So now you see, people with autistic disorder would have a problem with sensory modulation. So hence we would see some of them, they won't respond to anything. You call them, they would see people running, they will just be at one place. So that's what sensory modulation means. So with this sensory modulation, as I'm saying, most of people with autism have a problem. We would find that they present differently, as it's also been divided in three subtypes. The first subtypes, we think they are over responsive. They respond over to sensory information. The second one, we say they under respond, meaning you would touch the person, then they won't give you any reaction. There's under response. Then there's those ones that we are saying they are sensory seeking or sensory craving. These are the kids that you would find, trying to clap, stimulate. They are sort of self-stimulating, but I would also try to explain it and give brief examples on each 3 of them. So now let's start with the sensory responsivity. So now we say it might be characterized as a sensory exaggeration. You exaggerate the response to sensory input. For example, we find kids with autism spectrum disorder, some of them, they cannot tolerate certain types of clothes. You put something that is wool, they won't want to wear it. They would prefer certain types of clothing. Some, they wouldn't even want to go to the playgrounds where there are swings, those movements. No, they would try by all means to avoid those kind of things. So now imagine if we have this child that prefers only to wear silky clothes. What happens to that child during winter? And there's one thing that I've actually realized among children living with spectrum disorder. They tend to, those ones that we are saying they are over responding, they tend to fall in love with certain clothes. For instance, if the child loves certain t-shirt, they would always want to wear it. So those are the things that we really need to unpack today, or like how do we deal with things like that? Because imagine now if the t-shirt happens to be dirty and the child wants to wear it, or now we happen to walk around and see somebody that's wearing the same t-shirt, that child will probably think it's his. So those are the things that I say we want to unpack so that we know how best we can assist them. So now, these kids also that are over responsive, we see them like having difficulty in tolerating certain food. You see the child only wanting to eat yogurt. Anything that is hard, they will stay away from it. Your fruits, they wouldn't want to eat it, so they might appear as a pick eaters. And now this is the thing that we also wouldn't want the child to have a problem with, because children needs nutritional food. Everything must be included in there. So if this is the child that would decide that they will only want to eat your yogurt, but they wouldn't want to eat your meat or your fruits, you see, now they would have deficiency in terms of their nutritional needs. So that's what we call, they are over responsive. They are giving that kind of a respond to the input. They exaggerate it. So now the second one is what we call under responsivity, meaning this one, they are quite passive. They lack response. There's insufficient response to sensory input. So now example will be our kids that they would present like they are daydreaming. They are unfocused of what is happening around them. For instance, now should the siren ring here and everybody stand up and flee or run, them it won't affect them. It will be nothing happened, because they have that what we call insufficient respond ability. They are passive, they lack responsivity. So most of them, you will find them being on their own, quiet, isolated, as I'm saying. So imagine this kind of child in the class now. Here is the child that when the teacher says, when I do this stand up, he's on his own world. So those are the things that I'm saying we need to unpack and see how we can best address them. Because these are children that are not interested in participating in anything. Isn't it? They are focused in their own world. As I said, here is the phone ringing, you're calling the child is not responding at all, because they have what we call under responsivity, sensory modulation. So the last one is what we call sensory craving, or they are seeking sensory. They are self-stimulating. So now these ones, we would see them they would constantly be seeking sensory input. These are the kids that love to be touched quite a lot. They want to hug everybody now and then. You find most of them wanting, wherever they are, they keep on clapping non-stop. These are kids that most of them might also prevent with self-injurious behavior, such as banging their head against anything. You find others trying to, as if they're chewing their own teeth, making that sound, so that it just stimulates. They always want to create sensory input, even if it's not necessary. So now, these kids, they are very impulsive. Like I'm saying, they are forever, in the rocking movement, some of them clapping, making noise, sudden noise. You would hear the child singing. So those are the kids that we would say they present with what we call sensory craving. So because these people, now recently I've heard people referring to autism as a neurodivergent, meaning that it is true, it is like that, because these are people that their brains work differently to people without autism. So now I used to explain it to people, especially if now you go through our rural areas where people might take long to understand the condition. So this is how I used to break it down. I would say, let's take it over. These are kids with minds that sort of programs whatever happens. So if you're working with kids like this, you need to work closely with the parents, because whatever you're going to be doing, the parents is going to sustain it or take it further. So with, as I said, because they've got those behavior that are not common, that are not sort of, they are maladaptive responses. They are not responses that the sensory is actually giving or the environment is actually giving. So how the way that I would used to say, as I said, like these are kids that are having the brain sort of programming. So now one thing we should remember, one thing with children with autism, isn't it most of them, like, they record things, they program it. So now you're having a child with autism, and then you can see this child programs everything. So that's where I think we tend to have a bit of a problem. With children with autism, we need to try by all means to avoid things like having a routine. You don't ever try to introduce routine that is same every day. I will tell you why. If you teach the child of autism that when they wake up, the first thing that they bath at 6 o'clock, and now you've been doing it like consistently, so the day you want that child to bath earlier than that, there will be a problem. He won't be able, because to him he already programmed that. So the other ones that would say, I remember once I had this child that was a patient, and then I was explaining to the mother, like, we need to do what we call behavior modification. We must break those patterns that we do not want and reinforce or facilitate normal behavior that the child will also be able to be integrated into community as well, and interact with, play with the peers and so forth should the child go to school. So now the mother said to me that every time, I think the mother was running a business, so, and the business was sort of a door-to-door, they would drive around the community. Now she would take this child, but now here is the issue. This child, by the time they leave the house, they would stop at the nearest shop and buy this child Zimbas. So now the other day it happened that when they wanted to buy the provision that they would buy for this child, the shop was closed. Now the journey could not continue. And this is the thing that the lady was not aware, that she's creating a problem. So that's why I'm saying with autism, you become very creative with them. Today we start this way, tomorrow we do that way. For instance, we know in African culture, we believe that if you want to bring the child to rest, or when they are hysteric, they are crying, it's better you carry them on your back. With autism, you do it, but make sure that you don't do it at the same time every day, because now should you not be around that day to carry the child on your back, it's going to be a problem. Nobody will be able to control that child. So those are the things that I want to bring across, that these are the kids that are very loving, they are very kind, they just need to be understood, so that they can also be integrated, because there are many people that are having these conditions that have gone far. And one thing that we should, that I always say, it's actually the best remedy towards autism. It's early discovery. Once you pick up those symptoms that we've already mentioned earlier, it's better to come forward, because even the researchers show that the early detection, the early identification of the condition, the better the results. And that happens because of things like neuroplasticity, because there we are able to help to rewire the brain quicker, and because now the child is still growing, we are able to model the child from what we want them to be. Because remember, there are those ones that will talk, there are those that might not talk, but the ones without communication, it doesn't mean that also life ends there. They still need to live. So hence I'm saying we need to see how best we can integrate all sorts of therapies that are available to be able to help the kids. There has been quite a lot. I think I'm one of people that actually love to or enjoy to work with conditions such as autism, because if you have picked it up early and then you become consistent with it, the results are amazing. They are marvelous. They do great things. So as we are saying, this is one condition that we need to understand. We need to be kind with it. We need to be firm with the child. And we need to be gentle because we might be surprised what these kids can deliver. They are highly gifted. Thank you.